special pleasure for me. I want to apologize to all the friends who came and who saw me while I was trying to get the slides set up, because I did not have a chance to talk with you as much as I'd like. It's very important that I be able to do so, but especially since this is the first chance that I've had to get back to San Francisco State since I left 4.5 years ago. But I was very pleased to have this as the occasion for a chance to return home, as it were, and to have the topic that was presented to me by Tashaka, and that topic is why Egypt for African Americans. For those of you who know, I do about a 3-hour slideshow on this topic. I'm not going to do a 3-hour slideshow today. As a matter of fact, I will show some slides only for the benefit of those who may not have had a chance to see the regular presentation. But what I really want to do is to get into the reasons for doing this. You know, why is it that for African Americans we should be concerned with something as far away and as long ago as Egypt, or as I prefer to call it, Kemet, which is the name that the Egyptians call themselves. They were not called Egyptians. If I were to ask many African Americans what the year is, they would say 1985. When, from an African perspective, it's 4,237. Because Africans were the first to come up with an accurate calendar. And in fact, the calendar that they came up with in Egypt is still the most accurate calendar that exists. If I were to ask African Americans what happened in 1492, and if I got an answer that said Columbus sailed the ocean blue, it would typify one of the problems that we have, which is that for some people, the fact that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 is the most important thing about that year. But for Africans, that was also the year when the Moors were kicked out of Spain, just a day or so before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, ending approximately 700 years of contribution of African culture to the European continent. If I were to ask some African students and African American students, can you tell me something about the virgin birth? In all probability, they would talk about the virgin birth of Christ, but would be not aware of the fact that the first time in history that a story about a virgin birth appeared, that is to say, a god and a woman cohabiting to produce a son, which is then an immaculate conception, is the kind of birth that occurred first in Kemet, or in Egypt, or actually deeper into Africa. When I went to school, there was one book that was presented to African Americans, and that book was called, a history book, it was called Up From Slavery. So whenever anyone wanted to talk about the history of African American people, they started it with slavery. And what happened that was important was thought to be what happened after slavery. A little later on, during the 60s, there was another book that came out on the history of African people, and it was called From Slavery to Freedom. From Slavery to Freedom. But once again, even though this was a new contribution and a much improved contribution, it still started with the assumption that the most important thing you can say about Africans and African Americans happened from the slavery period on, which in fact leaves out the most important period of the development of African and African American people. I have some assertions that I want to make very briefly before, and I have some slides to show to back up those assertions in part, before I get into the meat of what I'd like to share, which is why is this important? Particularly, why Egypt? Why is Egypt important? Why not Nigeria? Why not South Africa or Nyanza? Why not Namibia? Why not any of the other countries that we could have talked about? you'll see that we, in fact, are talking about all of those places at the same time that we talk about Kemet. Assertions. Humankind began in Africa, near Lake Nyanza, and was black. The world's first people began in Africa, near Lake Nyanza, which you now call Lake Victoria, and was black. And from that part, spread out through all over the world, and physical appearance changed as they adapted to their environmental conditions. Number two, in that same area, the beginnings of civilization started and moved down the Nile. Remember, in Africa you go up south and down north. Moved down the Nile and produced Africa's first classical civilization and the world's oldest, which you call Egypt, and I prefer to call Kemet. Egypt, which is up in that little northeast corner of the continent of Africa, third assertion, Egypt is the child of inner Africa. It is not produced by the Middle East, or the Far East, or the North, or the West. It is produced wholly and totally by the southern origin, by that southern culture that became Egypt. Fourth, Egypt, or Kemet, like Africa, began as a black civilization. Now, to keep you oriented, you need to know that there were 30 kingdoms in Egypt. Of those kingdoms, the first 12 were native black African kingdoms. The 18th kingdom was a native black African kingdom, and the 25th kingdom was a native black African kingdom. So there were some invasions. Egypt, or Kemet, as I prefer to call it, is the world's second oldest recorded nation. Remember, I talked about civilization first, but now I'm saying nation. It's the second, not the first, oldest recorded nation. The oldest recorded nation in the world is Taseti. Taseti, land of the bow, which is older than Egypt, and it's further south. It comes from Nubia. As you know, Nubia is south of Egypt. The next assertion is that Egypt, or Kemet's major contributions came under native African leadership. The temple that you call Luxor, or the temple that you call Karnak, that was built in the time of the, you know, King Tut, Nefertiti, Akhenaten, and all of those temples were built when Africa was under the control of native black African people. Kemet was. And then there was another restoration kingdom, which was the 25th. And that also came from the south, and they were natives. And the next time that you get a real building period is the last kingdom. And there's something very peculiar about that building period, and I'm going to show that to you. Because it's the only period where there's really a vast development project, so to speak, by people other than the native black Africans. And that was a European imitation of African creations in the 30th kingdom. Then native Africans were driven from Kemet and from the Nile Valley by various invasions and settled in other parts of Africa, both before there was a Kemet and after Kemet. In other words, there is a connection, is what I'm saying, between the Africans in the eastern Nile Valley and the rest of the continent, so that you are not neglecting the rest of the continent when you focus on the ancient civilization of Kemet. And then Kemet was a major influence on world civilization and is the major parent of Western civilization, which justifies Kemet as an area of study in any academic institution worthy of the name. that would seek to look at world history and not simply at African history. Because if you're looking at, especially if you're looking at Western history, you have no explanation for Western history in the absence of an understanding of what happened in Kemet. And then finally, ancient Kemet has a cultural unity with the rest of the African continent. In other words, people in Kemet act like those Africans live like the Africans everywhere else on the continent. Those are the important points. Now, if I had time, I would take my full 3-hour thing and try to illustrate all of those points. But you just have to take some of these points on faith. But I had to state the points because I want you to know that they are important points. And so when we begin to ask the question, why is it important for African Americans to study this, and especially to study Kemet or Egypt, and then to know about that, what good does that do? You know, what's the purpose? Couldn't you be better off studying slavery, like most African American historians have done, and other historians who have studied black people? Wouldn't it be better to study slavery and what happened after slavery, or maybe even the civil rights movement? And wouldn't you be better able to understand African people and African American people by doing that? And of course, my answer to that is no, that you'd have to do that, but you'd have to do much more. Everything that I've said has been debated for many years, but the latest debate, one of the best debates, took place with a man named Cheikh Anta Diop leading the debate in the United Nations. And in the United Nations, he had to debate some of his former professors. And in that debate, which was a debate on the peopling of ancient Egypt, there was a conclusion to the debate in which the people who convened the debate said everybody who came to this meeting knew what they were supposed to do. They knew what the topic was, and they knew the level of evidence that was required to talk about the subject. But not everyone who came to this debate was equal in their preparation, painstaking and careful, to Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga. As a result, there was a real lack of balance in the discussion. In other words, in debating whether the ancient people of Egypt, which we grant was a great civilization, were black people or not, Dr. Diop and Obenga overwhelmed the opposition, many of whom had been their teachers. And in doing that, they gave 12 categories to prove those things that I just said to you. And I want to just mention the categories of information, because so often when we talk about the fact that this was a black civilization that was important to the rest of the world, those are things that some of us would like to believe, but we really don't even trust it because we are not familiar with the evidence. Specifically, the 12 categories of information are categories that converge to make this case. Any one of the categories would be sufficient almost to make the case. But Dr. Diop, a physicist, chemist, mathematician, linguist, and a historian, a multi-genius from Senegal, has pulled together in one short article the essence of his life's work. And that article was presented at this UNESCO conference. By the way, after Diop and others presented this information at UNESCO, one of the areas of proof that he presented was that you could tell whether mummies were black people or white people by taking a chemical, making a chemical analysis of the skin. There's a skin test to tell how much melanin there is in the skin. Mummies, shortly after that, disappeared from the Cairo Museum. We were there this summer and couldn't see a mummy. We were in Luxor and could not see a mummy. And so the debate could be settled just on that score alone. All that's necessary is a 100-watt bulb, a microscope, and one chemical, ethyl benzoate. Ethyl benzoate to put on a few square millimeters of skin, a 100-watt bulb to shine on that skin and look at it under a microscope, and the melanin granules will become fluorescent. And if that's a dark person, there'll be plenty of melanin. If that's a light person, there won't be much melanin. This is available. So that's one of the categories of proof that Dr. Diop submitted. A second category of proof is that 150,000 years ago, beings that are morphologically identical with man today, that is Homo sapiens sapiens, lived in the Great Lakes region. And that these early people were ethnically homogeneous, negroid, dark pigmented people. Now, I'm not talking about the ones 15 million years ago that were hominoids, man-like creatures, the ones that are just coming out of the eighth stage. I'm talking about Homo sapiens sapiens, those that would look comfortable in this room. Were there 150,000 years ago, making them the first Homo sapiens sapiens on the face of the earth, just as the first hominoids on the face of the earth are found in that same region. For example, if you're looking for early man, then it used to start that search in Europe, and they could push the age of early man back to 500,000 years in Europe, and then they ran out. And then they said, well, maybe we should go over to China. And they went to China, and they pushed it back to about 1 million years. And then they ran out. And then finally had to come home to the home of mankind, which was in the Nile Valley, near Lake Nyanza. And they've got it back now about 15 million years. But Lucy, for example, is a fossil that's 3.7 million years old. And then there's a 5 million year old jaw that they just found. These are human beings in effect. So that you're saying that for the first 4 million years that human beings were on the face of the earth, they're all found in one little tight space around Lake Nyanza at the headwaters of the Nile River. And it's these people then that will move out and become the peoples of the world. That's a category of proof that's subject to testing. Secondly, human images, that you can take some of the pictures like the ones that I'm going to show you, and you can see what they look like. So you take your earliest pictures and your latest pictures and you make comparisons. And I'm going to run you through some of that very briefly in just a moment. I mentioned the melanin dosage test. Then he talks about a category of physical anthropology evidence, taking skull classifications of the early dynasties in Egypt, for example. And almost all of those skulls that they find and classify in the early kingdoms are negroid skulls. Then you can take bone measures, the measures of the skeletal framework, and there are studies that can be done on that. Now it's also possible to do studies of blood groups. For example, Egyptians as a blood group, even today, are group B, just as is true of most West Africans. Whereas with most Northern Europeans it would be group A. And then there is the testimony of classical authors. We mean classical Western authors such as Herodotus, Aristotle, Lucian, and others. And then there is what the Egyptians said about themselves. They refer to themselves as Kemet, K-M-T, which some authorities want to say means the Black Land. Because as you know, the Nile River floods, and dirt from Ethiopia and dirt from the area around the Great Lakes washes down each year, or used to before the dam, and deposits itself in the valley, and you got very rich dirt that made it possible to grow some of the best crops in the world. And some people said that KMT referred to dirt, the color of the dirt, rather than the color of the people. But in hieroglyphics, the word, if it has a T on it, KMT, refers to people, especially if it has the determinative of a little person sitting behind the hieroglyphic word, like a god, a man, or a woman, or a person, which it most often did. That no longer refers to dirt. The determinative tells you that you're talking about people. Then there is the evidence from the history of religion. Some of the names, for example, that were applied to the gods. For example, most of the gods of Egypt had names that referred to them as names such as the Black God, like Osiris. One of his names was K-M-W-R, Kimbra, the Great Negro. Most of the gods, like men and others, were always shown as black. And then there's the evidence that comes from the Bible, which talks about Ham and his sons, Cush, Mizraim, which was Egypt, and Cush was a little south of Egypt, and then there was also Phut and Canaan. But it locates the black population clearly in the Egyptian and in the southern region of area south of Egypt. And then there's cultural information, cultural unity. In other words, circumcision, the social organization, the way the kinship lines are organized, the worldview, the matriarchy, the language. In other words, there's a unity between those cultural features in the north and east of Africa and the rest of the African continent. And then finally, Diop makes a special case about linguistic affinity. The genetic kinship of Egyptian and West African languages is another proof of the fact that you're talking about the same people who merely migrated at one of the many times of migration during the history of Africa. So those are some of the assertions of proof. Those are some of the assertions about the history of African people in Egypt and its connection to the rest of Africa. Those are some of the categories of proof that we can use. Now, what I'd like to do at this moment, if I can have the slides, I'm going to just run through briefly some of the slides to try to show you with one of those categories of proof what you get when you do it right. I think you can hear me here, right? Don't get much. Is it moving? Okay. Some of you know that I take groups to Egypt each summer now so that you can see these things firsthand. But you're looking now at a side view of the Sphinx that I took in Egypt. And your eyes ought to tell you the whole story. This is the thing that made people like Gustave Flaubert and other travelers to Egypt say that the ancient Egyptians were Ethiopians. This was always called an Ethiopian monument. By the way, if you go to Egypt on a regular tour, usually what happens, it gets to be about 110 degrees. You will stop in front of this Sphinx and look at it from the front view instead of from the side view. And you really need to be able to leave from the front of that statue and walk around about half a block and look at it from the side and see its profile. And you'll see that even with the nose missing, it is clearly an Ethiopian monument. And this is the oldest monument in the valley. It's older than the pyramid. Some people say it's younger than the pyramid, and they try to say it's one of the pharaohs, but this apparently was there many, many years before the first pharaoh of Egypt even was on the ground. There's no hieroglyphics associated with this at all. And then if you go down to the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose, and you look at the Sphinx, then you will get a different notion. This is the real. This is God, the first, one of the oldest forms of God, Osiris. He was always shown as a black god. These are the gods that were later copied by the Greeks when they set up their religion. And Osiris becomes Zeus and has the characteristics, Zeus has the characteristics of Osiris. This was recognized by the ancient Greek historians. As a matter of fact, there's a young man named Bernal, Martin Bernal, who graduated from Cambridge and who did his PhD in Egyptology and who has written a whole study called Black Athena, the denial of the Afro-Asiatic roots of Greece. And it's his thesis that the Grecian civilization was the product of Asian and African cultural influences which produced them. And it's a beautiful piece of work, and if anyone's interested, I'm going to leave those references with Professor Shaka. When I talked to you about the virgin birth before, you can go to the temple of Dendera, you can go to Hatshepsut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, you can go to any number of places in Egypt, and long before the year 0, here were images of the virgin birth. Now this is a copy of what you will find in the temple at Dendera. And you see the pharaoh lying on his back. Actually, that's God, Osiris, lying on his back. His wife is in the form of a bird. You see his erect phallus. And you see the bird about to be impregnated by God, which is the Immaculate Conception. This is one of the earliest renditions of the Immaculate Conception. Osiris impregnating Isis. And this is the way it actually looks in the temple. Okay, that story goes all the way back to the beginning of Egypt. If we look at the first king of Egypt, and I just want to run through some of the kings of Egypt, and then I want to show you what happened in the 30th kingdom when we get one of the last invasions of Africa. This is the first king, Mene. This is a later king in the 3rd dynasty. And this king, Zoser, in the 3rd dynasty, was the one that was supposed to be the builder of one of the great pyramids. This king is in the 12th dynasty. Now, when you go to the Cairo Museum, you'll find him standing in a corner all by himself. The name of the temple was Ipet Isut, which meant the most selected places. Now, in the university, you should be real interested in this because this is one of the world's oldest universities. At one point, there were 80,000 students studying at this university, Ipet Isut, which means the most selected places. It's in the city that you call Luxor, but its Kemetic or Egyptian name is Waset or Wosei, which means the scepter. So this is the building that's in the town that's called the scepter, and of that city, in that city, this is the most select place in the city. In other words, it is located at the holiest spot in the city. This spot was so holy that later the Muslims would come along and build their temple in the top of this temple when it was partially covered, because they knew that was the holy spot. And later Christians would come in and build a chapel in the same place, in this same temple. This is big enough to house Notre Dame Cathedral, I don't know how many times. And this is the man who designed it. Amenhotep's son of Hapu, a scribe, engineer, and architect. And I just want you to get a flavor for some of the people who were doing all this building. That was in the 18th kingdom, by the way. This is also in the 18th kingdom. This is the mother of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who was the father of monotheism, and also the father of nonviolent resistance, which is one of the reasons that he almost lost his kingdom, probably lost his life, because the priesthood overthrew him and put his little brother, King Tut, on the throne. But this was the mother, at least of Akhenaten, maybe the mother of King Tut. She was one of the queens of Egypt, one of the many queens of Egypt. She was a co-ruler with her husband. Some of the queens of Egypt actually ruled in their own right. Okay, now we're going to switch, because I was in the first 12 dynasties and the 18th dynasty. And we're going to go right now to the last kingdom, and I want to show you what happens. No, you got the wrong tray. It's the tray that has just about 6. Oh wait, no, maybe not. No, hold it. Let's do it. Okay, now, yeah, you got the right tray. Sorry. Okay, now we skip to the 30th kingdom. You're looking at Alexander the Great. I want you to see how different the physical appearance is between those people who control in the 30th kingdom and the one that you've been looking at before. But look what they do after Alexander. You get the Ptolemaic pharaohs that begin to put on Egyptian clothes. Now, you conquered Egypt. Why would you wear Egyptian clothes if you're the conqueror? Why would you join the Egyptian church? Why would you call yourself a pharaoh? Why would you have an urban renewal project and rebuild all the churches? Why would you listen to all of the priests of Egypt and take your orders for them for almost 650 years? Why would you take, for example, this is the temple of Edfu at Horus, temple of Horus at Edfu, and on this temple you'll see the pharaoh here, and he's a European-looking pharaoh, but here he is observing African religious tradition. Now, why would you, after you do this in Africa, then take this religion home? And why would you let that become the religion of Europe for almost 650 years? that is to say the religion of Isis, Horus, and Osiris, was the major religion in Europe up until the time of the convening of the Council of Nicaea, 323-325 AD. So it was at that point that you had the formal establishment of the Christian church, which eliminated the competition and then allowed the nation of Rome to be unified both politically and religiously. In other words, the priesthood for the religion would then be an indigenous priesthood in Rome, and they would no longer be dependent upon a foreign priesthood. So that was one of the major moves that was made by the king, Constantine, who himself was not even a member, as far as we know, of any religion. And this is another example of the same thing. So that when people go to visit in Egypt, if you happen to be one of those people that takes the regular tour, and you begin to go to some of the temples, and you'll see the faces of some of the pharaohs on the sides of the wall, you will conclude that they all look like people in the last kingdom. You'll go into the Cairo Museum, and these are the mummies that you will see. These are mummies that were made by Europeans after they conquered Egypt, because they joined the religion and they began to mummify their bodies and then paint their faces on the outside of the mummy casing. But these are foreigners, and they are not indigenous people. And so it becomes very important to keep the order straight if you want to know what actually took place. And it's because of mummies like this, it's because of figures like this, it's because of figures like this that people go to Egypt and conclude that Egypt was a white civilization, and then Hollywood takes over and began to perpetuate the rest of the As I indicated, you can cut the slides off right now. As I indicated, there was in Egypt a civilization that lasted unbroken for almost 3,000 years. Almost 3,000 years. Even after Egypt was conquered, the civilization continued to be practiced because the conquerors were so impressed with what they found that they imitated rather than destroyed what they found. But then there came a day when destruction was necessary. The destruction of African civilization, as written about by Chancellor Williams, is represented by such things as school closings. In other words, it got to a point where the conquerors of Egypt could, and in the rest of Africa as well, could no longer permit the native schools to function. Schools like the university at Sut that had 80,000 students there. Those schools had to be closed down. The library, every school had a library. That is to say, every temple had a library. Libraries were so important in Egypt, they were there long before the Library of Alexandria. Remember, the Library of Alexandria was burned, and you get the impression that was the first library in Africa. It wasn't. The very first library in Africa is at least as old as the first kingdom in Egypt, and probably older. In fact, in the hieroglyphics, there's reference to the fact that in the 4th dynasty, they had so many books that in the federal government, so to speak, there was a man who had the title governor of the house of books. That means library. So that there were libraries all the way back as early as 2,700 years before Christ. Those books had to be destroyed. And then Africa's civilization was destroyed, or at least the attempt was made to destroy it, by changing the names of everything. So that you now call Egypt, Egypt, which is a Greek word that referred to the fact that it was Ethiopian. It probably comes from something like Coptic, and by the time you begin to play with it enough, it'll come out something like Egypt, Egyptos, referring to the Copts. And instead of calling it Kemet, which is what they call themselves, you'll call the town of Luxor, Luxor. That's the name the Arabs gave to it. Before that, the Greeks gave it the name Thebes, or Thebes. But before that, it was called Waset, or Woseh. And if you take my name, you suddenly lose any opportunity to understand the meaning that I reflect and represent. The names of persons had to be changed. For example, one of the people that I could have shown you on the slide's name was Menkaura. His name gets changed to Mycerinus by the Greeks. So it sounds like a Greek name. But more than that, you lose the fact that he named himself after two gods, Men And then Ka is the soul, and Ra is another god, the soul of two gods. Here's the Pharaoh who had meaning to his name. His name was changed. The names of nations are changed. The name even of the things that you write in are changed. For example, you refer to the writing of ancient Egypt as hieroglyphics. The name that the Egyptians gave to it was Medu Neteru, which means the sacred writing, or the holy script, or if you will, the Holy Bible, the writing of the God. Medu is writing, and Neteru is a collection of gods. And if you call it hieroglyphics, we don't know exactly what that means. The destruction of African civilization was also brought about by changing the order of things. So that if you go to Egypt and you start studying the 30th dynasty, that is to say the Ptolemaic pharaohs, the Greek and Roman pharaohs, and you don't start studying with the first dynasty, then you will get a distorted impression of what actually went on and who was responsible. And then there is a representation. You know, once the destruction occurred, then there's a representation of the history of the world, of Egypt, of Africa. And that representation falls into two categories at least, one of which is an academic representation. The academic representation is such that there is a period of time, especially from the 1780, from about 1780 to 1980, during which the history of the world was rewritten to conform to the view that was needed in order to justify colonization. And so you begin then to get men like Hegel, who will say Africa is no part of human history. And what we see in it, that is in the northeast corner in Egypt, does not belong to Africa. Because Africa is that place that is still on the threshold of human history. That's Hegel in his philosophy of history. And then you will get Arnold Toynbee, who will say of the 21 civilizations that were created, the only group of people who never created even one of those was black people. And this was our great historian. And so here we see that following these men and others were a whole core of people who rewrote the books, who changed what had been known for years. The Greeks were not at all embarrassed about the fact that most of them went to school to get their master's degrees and doctorate degrees. If you were going to get a degree in higher education, at the time that Aristotle was teaching, you had to do it in Egypt, because that's where higher education was. You saw at Pedaisu. If you were going to get a degree in higher education at the time of Pythagoras, you had to go and spend, as Pythagoras did, 22 years studying in Egypt. If you were going to get a degree at the time of Plato, you had to spend 12 years studying in Egypt, as Plato did. But that knowledge was changed. I hope you get the point that I'm trying to make. Not only did it exist, not only did it happen, but we knew that it happened. We knew that Africans had a major part to play in world history, and said that, in other words, people wrote that down in books, but that about 200 years ago, the story got changed. That's the point I'm trying to make as clearly as I possibly can. And that's a part of the destruction of the history of African people. And then Hollywood gets into the act. Cecil B. DeMille begins to repicture the activities that take place in Egypt. Not just Cecil B. DeMille, but everyone. And now, I showed you the first early dynasty, what they look like. Instead, they will now begin to look like Carlton Heston, Elizabeth Taylor, and Yul Brynner. And therefore, you get a different story in the story of Isis and the story of Osiris, where Osiris was killed by his brother Set and torn into numerous pieces. And those pieces were scattered throughout the land. And they had to be brought back together. And it was the wife, Isis, who went out looking for those pieces. And every time she found one, she would build a monument in memory. And she found every piece except the main piece, which was the not sex, but generativity and creativity. And that part established what you call obelisks. The formal name for it is Tinkanu. And Washington, D.C. has one of those, Washington Monument, which is a copy of an African Tinkanu, which represents a generative creative, at least as far as African and African-American people are concerned. They have Europe. Why Hebrew history for Israel? Why European history for the United States? Why that South African history is to give people identity, purpose, and direction. It is important to study the history of Kemet, the history of Egypt. Many African Americans chanted that slogan, "We want our freedom, and we want it now." It made me write this little poem because I think that was the wrong thing to aspire to. Freedom was not enough. And the title of my poem is the question mark, freedom, a question, rather than the continuation of a struggle. Tyranny never sleeps. Of my formal presentation to you, and I will have hopefully some time for questions and answers. Really the answer to the first question that I started out with in the first place. Every year, I wish I could explain to you some things that I see happening with people who engage themselves in the deep study of some of the things that I've been talking about so in people as they become aware of certain important things. I've got a list of about 12 reasons that answer the question why that Professor Tashaka asked me. There may be 13 or 14 by the time I finish because I talked about these to my brother last night and he added a couple. He went with me on the trip and so he could testify from his own personal experience. Number one, for example, people talk about the ancestors all the time. Ancestors is the concrete notion of which ancestor and what those ancestors did, or even why to that is one reason. Secondly, it is a unique worldview but most worldviews are distorted, and they will always be distorted if they do not come from. Absolutely essential that I not try to explain myself in terms of a history in which I've never participated. And yet that is basically what we attempt to do. It is also important, in order to develop a longitudinal review I was showing you here, what you will see is what was before, what was later, and then you must study how it changed and how we lost our information about it. And you will see other aspects of the history of racial oppression. That becomes very important. It's important in terms of self-image. I wish you could see, we had a 12-year-old student who went on the tour. That's the youngest that we've had anyone on our tour, who went on the tour and went back to her private school when she got back to Atlanta, Georgia, and went back to her teacher and things that she had seen, and fired the teacher up so much that the teacher went to the principal and told the principal that the principal had to recreate a conference that we had done there in Atlanta. This little girl had also got her father, who was a dentist, to come to the Nile Valley Conference. It was one of the first of its kind in the United States. And then there was another one that we had in Atlanta where 21 presentations were made, multidisciplinary presentations were made. This little girl went and got her father, and he quit his practice for 3 days to come and attend this conference because she was so impressed with what had happened to her there. And then she is the same one who convinced her teacher that the headmaster of this primarily white public school, white private school, had to reproduce a part of the ancient Nile Valley Conference in order to do something for the black students at that school, but also to correct the version of history that was being passed out to the white students. And that headmaster called me and is very anxious to become involved in the reconstruction of the approach that they take to the teaching of history for all the children. And self-esteem. One of the things that we heard from some people, one of the young ladies who went on the trip with us was an airline stewardess. And she came back and she said, you know what I noticed now, that with adoption, you know how every so often you read in the paper, how children who are adopted, when you promised years ago that you would never reveal the identity of the parents. But the meaning memory has, the collective group memory has, is clearly hooked up to mental health. And here's one other that I've talked about so far. One reason for studying Kemet is to simply to say, isn't it interesting that these were black populations? And they did this very early because it was their turn. What is even more important than the high-tech contributions is the fact that they would go into some of the monuments and would read some of the material that was written on the walls and would begin to contemplate what was happening that spontaneously was created in the group when no one came there for that reason. The weaknesses of black people. The opportunity to study strengths and weaknesses, because to repeat the mistakes of the past and to fail to take advantage of the successes of the past. There's a basis for group unity. almost any group of people that intends to do study of Kemet in the final of all of Africa itself. To scientific racism, that at the University of Chicago, two professors, Dr. Darrell Bach and Dr. Elsie Moore, did a study for the United States Defense Department, and the headlines of newspapers 2 years ago carried the results of the study, saying that blacks and Hispanics get low scores, share in a weak genetic pool. This was on the front pages. This is not 19. This is 1982. Darrell Bach and Elsie Moore, University of Illinois in Chicago, and those people released a report that came out under the auspices of the Defense Department. Even if the defense, there's a group of people in the world who has never made any contribution to that world. This is the counter to that. Of Africans and African Americans. There's one thing that really bothers me about the way we refer to Africa as developing countries. Developing countries. If you're going to, is redeveloping countries. Because it was developed before. To call it a developing country, and that simply is not true. The real stage is a redeveloping stage that puts us at a position where we can move, if anything, to role models. There are some heroic figures. For example, it wasn't Hatshepsut. Some of you know that Hatshepsut was a fantastic ruler, the greatest rulers of the 18th kingdom. But she was not the first. In fact, the nation was in the first dynasty. She ruled in place of her husband, a regent. But there was also a woman who had a Horus name. That meant she was king, in fact. And that occurred in the third kingdom in Egypt. And there were at least 8 of them. Don't you think that as a role model, it means something for a young girl to call herself Mernid, or to call herself Hatshepsut, or to call herself a heroic figure that exemplifies the types of things, connectedness, our spiritual connectedness in the world. As I indicated to go there, but not even before then, in reading, and that these things, where any nation was truly devoted, every time that was available to me. Some assertions about who the ancient has been confused in the attempt to destroy information about African people, which means reviving the study of secretary. Both of them sitting down here. All right. Yes, we have questions? Yes. Could you repeat your question? I'm sorry. The first European invasion? Okay. The first European invasion was Alexander the Great. And that would be about 333, something like that. 320 to 330. I can't remember the exact date right now. But that would be Alexander the Great. Prior to that time, let me say this. Prior to that time, the first major invasion was an invasion from Asia that was called the Hyksos invasion. That's the invasion that wiped out the native kingdom of Africa, where the Pyramid Age had been built. And that is the age also when Abraham comes into Africa. During that same time, and then you get an exodus out of Africa after about 400 years of part of the people who had come in with the Asian group. The Hebrew group would leave at that time. So that, for those of you who know Bible history and you're trying to hook up this chronology with Bible history, that was the first invasion. Then after that you get Persian invasions well, a couple of other invasions before you finally get a European invasion, which is the last invasion. That's the invasion of Alexander the Great. And then that's followed up with the Roman Empire. And you have about a 600-year period during which Greece and Rome dominates Egypt. And there's no indigenous control except indirectly through the priesthood.
Yeah, I have a question in kind of an easy way. I have a question kind of leads away from Egypt itself. I'd like to address the migration patterns of Egyptians, mainly transatlantic travel, South America, Central America, and Mexico and beyond. Another point being is the Australian Aborigines and folks of that area who have a strong affinity to Africans and East Africans and et cetera. Just maybe you can spend some time addressing that.
Right. What you get is an equatorial band. In other words, if you start with a population that is centered at Lake Nyanza, you know that Lake Nyanza sits on the equator. That lake, which is one of the two sources of the Nile, sits on the equator. And if you follow the equator around the world, you see the same people. In other words, the migratory patterns of those who are most like the Africans who are there today is such that they will be found in the areas that are most similar in terms of climate. You know, for example, there's a migration that took them into Saudi Arabia, and then you get a heavy black population in India. And actually, you also get one in Iran and Persia. And there is a young man named Runoko Rashidi in Los Angeles who specializes in the African presence in Asia. You know, that's kind of surprising to a lot of people to find that Africans are to be found in Asia. You know, given the fact that you had these migrations out from the continent thousands of years ago, 50, 60,000 years ago, and people, you know, adjusted to their climates, and so you get all these physical differences. So it's a surprise in later time, you know, let's say 8,000 BC, 5,000 BC, to find that there are Africans in Asia. But it turns out the first population of India to develop in India, according to the best information that we have, was an African population, the Dravidian population of Africa. The Dravidian population in India still looks like Africans today. They are the people who form a large part of the outcast population today. There were invasions from northern India, which resulted in the setting up of a caste system in India. But the initial development in India of cultural forms was by Africans, and they reflect early African cultural forms. For example, the religion of India, Krishna, is very close to the religion that comes out of Africa. So that the person who really knows that better than actually Noble Rashid, he goes all the way over into the evidence for the fact that there were African populations in China. And this is before the colonial period. This is really far, far back in human history. For example, the name of the group in China that's an indigenous African population is called the Naki. Naki population, N-A-K-I population in China. There's African population in Russia from the time of Pharaoh's, of the invader Sesostris, or Pharaoh Sesostris, whose soldiers went all the way up, apparently as far as the Caspian Sea, and that population is still there. So when they say black Russians, there are a group of people who are black Russians. So if you follow that band all the way around, you will find that anywhere the Indian Ocean touches land, that you basically have a black population. Go the other way, and of course you're getting into the kind of material that Dr. Van Sertima has gotten into, which has to do with your Olmec population. Some people make a mistake and say the Olmecs were black. It was the rulers of the Olmecs who were black. The Olmec population was an indigenous population. We don't know what they were, but the ones who came in and set up certain kinds of forms of government and who apparently established a hegemony as a result of travel, it appears now, were those who came out of the 25th dynasty in Egypt, which was also a Nubian dynasty or a black dynasty in Egypt. And they brought with them pyramid building, and some things are almost identical in the writings, the hieroglyphic writing. Some of the things, some of the ceremonies are identical between what took place in the Olmec culture and what was taking place in Egyptian culture. So Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, will give, and I understand he's going to be here sometime this week or next week, will give a detailed documentation of that connection. Clive Winters, out of the university, well, I forget which university, but he's in Chicago. He is a linguist, and he's done some translation of the Olmec writing and finds it was written in a Malinka Bambara script, which is a North African script. It's Manding script, but the language was Malinka Bambara, which means it's both an African language and a North African script. So that when you translate what was written with the Olmec head, you also get African. So there's that. Then you go all the way around, and when you get out to Fiji, you shouldn't be surprised at the people you see there. Or when you get to Papua New Guinea, you shouldn't be surprised at the ones you see there. When you get to Samoa, you shouldn't be surprised, especially the old Samoans, or Hawaii, as you go around that tropical belt. And of course, some people have suggested that the Australian Aborigine, the native population of Australia, is not a black population, but I don't know how they come up with that. I think that's some new way of classifying the human population. Yes.
I'd like to say to Dr. Asa Hilliard that I'm very glad to have you back on campus. It's beautiful seeing you again. And now that I've said that, I'd like to make an announcement, Asa, if that's all right. It's not a question. I'd like to invite people to participate from 4 to 6 p.m. on tomorrow afternoon, on Tuesday afternoon, in a picket at the Pacific Maritime Association. The Pacific Maritime Association is located at 635 Sacramento near Kearney. The Pacific Maritime Association is the shipping consortium that brought a suit against the heroic longshore persons who refused to allow the cargo from South Africa. So pressure has been brought against them in the East Bay. We've been picketing PMA this is our 8th week in Oakland now, and they just started, the San Francisco people just started their activity, their effort last Tuesday, and the line was kind of slim because people don't know about it. So I told them I would try to get the word out at San Francisco State. Thank you for that commercial.
Okay. Thank you. See, you're still active. That's good. Okay, thank you.
This is just a general question. It's a question that students often ask us, and your explanation will be excellent. Just some listing of the Arab presence in Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
Kemet. And, well, I'll ask that one first.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, when our group got off the first group got to Cairo, and they started walking around, I was looking, there were some people there who were very depressed. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, and it hadn't dawned on me that what they had thought that they were going to see was a more stereotypically African population. And what they saw, of course, was a very mixed population. Those of you who've been to Cairo know that the population is very mixed. And there are some African, stereotypical African Nubian type in Cairo, but more of them appear to be from the countries that we associate with the Arabic countries, you know. But what you have to realize is, again, when did that occur? That occurred after Islam. You know, after Islam comes in the 7th century A.D. And then there's a spread of Arabic populations mixing with African populations across the whole north of Africa into places like Libya and Morocco and places like that. But prior to that time, in other words, when you have to ask yourself, when did the outside population settle in the Nile Valley? And I gave you the times when the first attempt to invade Africa came from Asia. And that was the very first invasion that occurred after the 12th Kingdom, approximately 2,000 years BC. But the only place that they located was around the area of the Delta, which was slightly below Cairo, down around the place of Alexandria and places